Okay, well, now it's time to turn over to our first panel, and we're going to continue on the theme of nuclear energy, and we're going to start talking about small modular nuclear reactors in more detail. And moderating today's panel, we have one of our distinguished alumnus, Casey Terrell, who's an associate with Crowley Fleck up in their Sheridan office, where he practices oil and gas law and commercial litigation. And he, as I mentioned, received a joint degree in master's from the Help School in Environment, Natural Resources, and a law degree a few years ago. And I was pleased to be one of Casey's professors when he was here. So it's great to have Casey back as a moderator of this panel. And Casey, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Temple, for those kind words. And I appreciate the opportunity to moderate this panel here today. I have to ask in advance that you all forgive any background noise that I'm not able to filter out. I'm on the road today. So as Temple mentioned, my name is Casey Terrell and I practice with Crowley Fleck. I'm also the E&R section chair for the Wyoming State Bar. I have the honor of moderating today's distinguished panel on small modular nuclear reactors. I'll provide a brief overview of small modular reactors, or SMRs, and then I'll turn it over to our wonderful panelists. SMRs receive their name due to the fact that they're usually 1/10 to 1/4 the size of traditional nuclear energy plants. And the simplified modular components they are often constructed out of result in less time to construct them and transport the reactors compared to traditional nuclear facilities. SMRs have been gaining in popularity over recent years for several different reasons. First, as the world looks to transition to low carbon energy resources or energy sources, SMRs can be used to supplement other clean energy sources on the grid, which can be intermittent in nature, such as wind or solar. Second, SMRs can provide grid-ready energy on short notice, which will be critical until battery technology advances. Third, because SMRs are just that small, they can more easily be set up at former traditional energy production sites, like coal-fired power plants. The Rocky Mountain region is fast becoming one of the epicenters of SMR development. The Utah Associated Municipal Power Systems, or UAMPS, formally launched the Carbon-Free Power Project in 2015 at the Idaho National Laboratory. The project calls for constructing a small modular reactor power plant on the 890 square mile Idaho site, using SMR technology being developed by NuScale Power. We have a panelist here today from the Idaho National Laboratory to share their knowledge of SMRs with you. SMRs also made headlines in Wyoming earlier this year when TerraPower announced plans to build a natrium demonstration reactor at a retiring coal-fired power plant in Wyoming in partnership with PacifiCorp. The reactor will feature a sodium fast reactor combined with a molten salt energy storage system. 4 possible locations are being considered, and the project is receiving support from the Department of Energy, which you heard from Dr. Catherine Huff this morning. We're also happy to welcome panelists today from TerraPower. Wyoming's legislature also addressed SMRs during their 2020 session. On March 13, 2020, Wyoming Governor Mark Gordon signed House Bill 74 into law. After the governor signed House Bill 74, it became House Enrolled Act 60, which allows utilities and other power plant owners to replace retiring coal and natural gas electric generation plants with SMRs. The bill also instructs the Wyoming Environmental Quality Council and Department of Environmental Quality to promulgate rules and regulations to authorize the permitting of SMRs. And you guessed it, we also have a panelist today from the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality here to speak to you today. Overall, small modular reactors look to be an exciting new resource to address the nation's ever-changing energy needs. Today, we have 3 outstanding folks here to talk to you about various aspects of SMRs, and I'd like to briefly introduce them. First will be Steve Almer. Dr. Almer serves as a senior advisor for nuclear energy programs and strategy at the Idaho National Laboratory. In this role, he's responsible for developing strategies, programs, initiatives, and partnerships to advance U.S. energy security and clean energy objectives. He's a recognized expert and thought leader in technology, business, and clean energy strategies. Second, we'll have Todd Parfit, the director of the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality. Todd was appointed to that position by Governor Matt Mead in October of 2012 and subsequently reappointed in January of 2019 by Governor Mark Gordon. He has 27 years of experience with the department, including 7 years in the dual role of Deputy Director and Administrator of the Industrial Siting Division. Parfit notably also served as President of the Environmental Council of States in 2017 to 2018. Last but certainly not least, we have Tara Nieder with us here today. Tara is Senior Vice President and Project Director, Natrium Demonstration Reactor at TerraPower. In this role, she leads TerraPower's efforts to demonstrate the Natrium reactor as part of the Department of Energy's Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program. Her team is responsible for plant design, testing, licensing, design integration, procurement, and project leadership and administration. A hearty thank you to our panelists for joining us here today. While they're speaking, please feel free to ask any questions you have in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. With that, I'll turn it over to Steve to get started.
Well, thanks, Casey. You gave a pretty good overview. Just want to do a microphone check, make sure I can be heard. Good. Okay, next slide. So I think, and go ahead and click through that 3 times. I think to really understand the what and why of microreactors, it's important to understand the context that these reactors have grown up in. So 60 years ago, when nuclear energy was first getting going, the world was really a very different place. First, commercial nuclear technologies came online. They were actually fairly small on the size of what you see in microreactors today. Today, much different world. You have a very mature commercial nuclear, global commercial nuclear business. It's projected to be about $2.6 trillion in size over the next 2 decades. So a very, very different world. Going forward, we do expect quite a lot of energy growth in the future, but maybe not as fast as what you saw before, especially in the Western world. So the market and the market pull for reactors, especially small and large reactors, I think has changed quite a bit. So let's keep this in mind as we go through. Next slide. Click through that twice, please. So why does size really matter? It matters quite a lot. Again, think about the context of the energy markets, both 60 years ago and today. The very quickly growing energy markets, and nuclear was first built into, really drew along the need for large reactors. And the reactors got fairly large in size, principally to match those large growing markets with efficiencies of scale. So bigger the size, the more efficient and effective building and operations were. But that had, of course, then many pretty significant implications on building those systems. The safety systems got very complex, especially with light water reactors, and they were definitely not modular. As you can see, this is a photo of a construction site. Actually, I think it's a construction site in Taiwan. But you can see they're not modular. They're really massive, individually engineered construction sites. And that created just a lot of complexity. And that complexity drove a lot of capital risk, financing costs, and things of that nature. And if you have a really fast growing market, then you can match, then you always have a load, you always have a market for all the energy that those gigawatt scale plants produce. But if you don't have a fast growing market, then you could have stranded capital as well. So challenges placing very large reactors into the markets today. Click, please. So size and power of the plants really did increase also as the industry matured. Again, 60 years ago, when the nuclear industry was just getting started, the reactors were small because industry was just learning how to build those. But 60 years later, 65 years later, you have a lot of learning that's taken place. Efficiencies of scale have become even more important, and reactors have gotten just massive in size. Next slide. So go back to, please. Forward one. There we go. Thank you. So let's compare the sizes then of the reactors. This is really at the heart of, I think, what's important. So you see how the market kind of drew along very large size reactors because of efficiencies of scale. You had big electricity markets to feed into and maturation in learning. So that gives us the existing very large reactors. You can see sort of what the footprint is of those systems. And on the left-hand side, it actually is a picture of the construction project at the reactor in Georgia, I believe that Dr. Huff mentioned. I think at one time that was the largest single construction project in the country. So you can see the footprint, the size, and the scale of these systems. Next slide. But then that takes you to small modular reactors. So we'll talk about why small modular reactors in a minute, but you see how different the footprint is as compared to the very large reactors. So there may be just a fraction of the land footprint. The emergency planning zone around these systems are much smaller. They're as Dr. Huff mentioned and Casey mentioned, they're factory fabricated modules, but they go into still a fairly significant capital construction project that has to go on to accept the reactor modules. So next slide. Then a class of small reactors, small modular reactors that I'm really excited in, I think has a lot of potential, gets even smaller in size, and those are sometimes referred to as microreactors. Microreactors sometimes are even thought of as an larger energy equivalent of a battery. So some of their modes of operation are actually called nuclear batteries, but the very small reactors, say this slide says 20 megawatts or less. And generally you can think about these even 50 megawatts or less, where small modular reactors, you typically think about 50 to a couple hundred megawatts. And then the large reactors are, of course, 1,000 megawatts or more. So next slide. So have we built all of these types of systems, and sort of where is the trend? The answer is we have built small modular reactors. We built very large reactors, of course, the 93 reactors that are operating, this commercial reactors operating in this country are the larger ones, but we've also done quite a few fairly small reactors. So just to give you a feel for how that size and the modularity has evolved, the shipping port reactor was the first commercial nuclear reactor in the country, and it was about 70 megawatts, 72 megawatt electric. Then the next evolution of power reactors got larger by about a factor of 10. And a nice example of that is the Cooper Power Station. I think that's actually in Nebraska, and that's a boiling water reactor. But you see it gets up to 800 megawatts, and these are all numbers in megawatt electric. So the actual heat output of that 800 megawatt plant is actually 2,000 plus megawatt thermal. And then you started getting into the really large plants, the AP1000s. Those are the type of plants that are being built in Georgia. Again, that massive construction project I showed you a picture of a minute ago. And there's even larger reactors than that, the European Pressurized Reactor, EPR. That's on the order of 1,600 megawatt electric. So you can see they're very large. They've gotten very large, have very complex systems built into them. Compare that with what NuScale is proposing to build in Idaho. So it is small and it is modular. Those are two different things. So the small size is a 60 megawatt per module, and the modularity comes in that you put modules together to better match, to add to your plant, to better match energy needs or the market that you might have. So that might suggest a better match for capital efficiency. Natrium, the TerraPower reactor that you'll hear about, 345 megawatts. But then you can see we've done in the military, of course, has operated very well on very small reactors and putting those reactors together to power the Navy. Evinci then is an example of a micro reactor on the 1 to 5 megawatt. Next slide. So advanced reactors are definitely trending smaller, they're trending integrated, they're trending modular. And why is that? And we've talked just a minute ago about what some of the reasons for that is. It's to match market, it's to reduce funding or funding risk, capital risk. It's to optimize cash flow so you can build systems out one module at a time or one reactor at a time. And these types of systems are, again, not brand new. Most of the new advanced reactors are built on really decades of DOE research. Next slide. And definitely remember, not all small reactors are modular, but no big reactor is modular. The modularity in many cases also means that the systems have been made to be integrated into the reactor. So on the left is a schematic of a typical pressurized water reactor and the safety and cooling systems. You can see those are separate from the core, which is the annular device right in the middle of that picture. Whereas the small modular reactors, many of them today are integrated. So all of those systems are integrated along with the core, and it makes them much simpler and reduces failure mode. So next slide. So that sort of integration you see taking place across a lot of industries. And this is actually really what gets me excited. You see integration and embedding of systems in more functional systems across different markets. I like to use the example of communications, either computers or telephones that have gone from these big, massive, highly integrated, clunky devices, really to miniaturized devices that have embedded power systems. Next slide. Question is, can you imagine something like that with energy? Go ahead and click through that slide, please. And I think you can, and it has very significant implications for what the markets might look like for advanced nuclear. If we want to be able to reduce carbon footprint across a number of industries, just attacking the challenge of grid scale electricity isn't going to be enough. If nuclear only plugs into grid scale electricity because electricity, say, is 25–35% of total energy markets going forward, and if nuclear only plugs into baseload electricity, then you can only touch with nuclear maybe 15–20% of the global energy demand with this clean energy. But if you start to imagine very small reactors embedded with industrial processes like trona production or in clean chemicals manufacturing, then you can begin to touch a vast array of high carbon emission, energy intense processes with this clean, very small nuclear sort of an approach. So next, last slide. And that paints a fascinating vision then for what the global market for nuclear could be. So we think about definitely beyond electricity, beyond baseload electricity, but I like to think about these very small reactors incrementally built into industrial processing, much of which actually some of this you see in Wyoming. I think this is really the future. This is the frontier for advanced nuclear and production technologies, producing synthetic fuels, producing net zero emission chemicals, plastics, fertilizers, even metals manufacturing, using a reactor that's plugged into the process, very similar to what you might have with a battery. So small reactors, there's a reason, there's a market pull, there's a very strong, I think, going to be a very strong demand for those, and it's a pretty exciting future. But keep in context this difference between and why very, very large reactors came up, and now there's much more of an interest in small, modular, and eventually in micro reactors that are embedded into processes. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Appreciate your thoughts today. Next, we'll be hearing from Todd Parfit with the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality.
Okay, not sure who the picture is that I'm seeing there. Is that you, Casey?
Yes, it is. You can ignore that, Todd.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Casey. And it's a pleasure to be participating today and talking about the siting and permitting of nuclear energy in Wyoming. I wanted to start out, if we go to the next slide, what I wanted to just point out right off the bat here is that the regulatory landscape in Wyoming has three primary articles in the Environmental Quality Act. The first being related to nuclear regulatory agreements or agreement state program with the NRC, radioactive waste storage facilities under Article 15, and small modular nuclear reactors, as has been mentioned, which was passed in 2020. And then also want to talk a little bit about the NRC authority, as that plays a critical role in how we implement our programs. So next slide. So as everybody knows, regulation of radioactive material is exclusively regulated or governed by the Atomic Energy Act. And under the Atomic Energy Act, there are certain types of radioactive material that can be implemented by the states through an agreement state process. And there are certain things that cannot be entered into an agreement state with the states. And examples of that would be production facilities like nuclear spent fuel reprocessing, and utilization facilities like nuclear reactors, as we're talking about today. So that's important to keep in mind as we have this conversation. So next slide. So the process for becoming an agreement state began in Wyoming back in 2015, when the legislature gave the DEQ the authority to establish a uranium recovery program and enter into those discussions with the NRC. We were able to stand up the program relatively quickly in about 3.5 years, compared to what other states had experienced of a 5 to 6 year stand-up time. The process that we went through with the NRC was a very rigorous process to ensure that all the required elements and safety procedures were compatible with the NRC. I do have to just real quickly mention that we do have a very incredible staff in the uranium recovery program, which includes 2 health physicists, 1 nuclear engineer, and then other expertise in geology, hydrogeology, and complex modeling. So next slide. So our agreement state is program is a limited agreement, which gives us authority over source materials for uranium and thorium and byproduct material associated with producing the source material. The next slide. So I raised the point about the agreement state primarily because it demonstrates that we do have the expertise in-house to address these issues as they come up, whether it be with radioactive waste storage facilities or SMRs. Now, I wanted to walk through the radioactive waste storage facilities, Article 15, and just kind of lay out how that process would work. Now, first off, the Article 15 for the radioactive waste storage facilities was adopted back in 1995. It's been amended a few times since then, but it came about because there was interest in the early 90s for creating a temporary spent nuclear fuel storage facility in the Gas Hills. And the outcome was the development of Article 15. So the process under Article 15 for somebody interested in having a temporary spent nuclear fuel storage facility will be first through the application process. Now, the application process, just to be clear, exempts, Article 15 rather, exempts the facility from the Industrial Siting Act. And I think primarily that was done because the application process in Article 15, it somewhat duplicates what the Industrial Siting Act would do. So the application process would include discussions in the application about how the site was chosen, the feasibility of the technology. It would look at the environmental, social, and economic impacts and ensure conformance with federal guidelines. There is an application fee associated with this, and in today's dollars, that would be an $863,000 application fee to cover the costs of the agency to review the application. Now, one of the things that you'll see throughout Article 15 and also in Article 21 is that you'll see a lot of reference to the NRC and that what activities that we will be performing as the DEQ are not to interfere with the NRC's authority over radioactive waste storage or nuclear reactors, but rather to ensure that we don't duplicate and don't interfere or preempt the authority of the NRC. So next slide. Okay, so the next step after the application is submitted and the fees are paid, the DEQ starts a process of evaluating the application and drafting a report. We have 21 months to develop that report, examine the socioeconomic impacts, the environmental impacts, and included in that is developing a report that it would be somewhat similar to a report that you would see under the NEPA process. Now, it does give the option of preparing a joint report with the NRC under NEPA, but I'm not sure how likely that would be, whether NRC, they would have to be agreeable to that process. The report that we would prepare would also include what's called a benefits agreement. And the benefits agreement would address things like the number and types of jobs that would be created, the taxes that would be associated with the project, would address safety and management of the facility as well. And then lastly, the report would identify the recommended action from amongst the alternatives evaluated. So next slide. All right, so we've got the application, we've had the application, we've developed a report, and the next step in the process is to go out for public review. And there would be an opportunity not only for public review and comment, but there would be public hearings that would be held in the county and counties associated with the facility. And then there would also be hearings in other locations throughout the state. Now, the important point here is that once we've held the public comment and addressed the comments from the public, we look to whether or not we can submit the report to the legislature. And the key here is we're stopped at this point. We can't proceed until such time as the Department of Energy issues a final environmental impact statement for a permanent repository. You heard Dr. Huff talk about that earlier, is that right now there isn't a permanent repository. So essentially, there not being a permanent repository, we wouldn't be able to proceed beyond this point. So next slide. All right. Now, if there were a permanent repository, then we would make the submission to the legislature, and the legislature would look at the materials, which would include the report, the preferred alternative, any conditions that would need to be part of the permit. We talked about the benefits agreement and a summary of how we've addressed the public comments. So again, we only proceed on this process moving forward if there's a permanent repository. So next slide. Now, like all good legislation, there's always an exception. So here we have an exception that, well, let me back up. There is one exception to which, in order for a project to go forward, it has to be approved by the legislature and requires enacted legislation, like I said, with one exception. Now, the duration of these temporary storage facilities can be no longer than 40 years. So if you want to know what the definition of temporary is, it's 40 years. Now, that 40 years can be extended, but that would be done by the legislature. And then if the legislature authorizes the project to move forward, the DEQ shall, we don't have an option, the DEQ shall issue a permit with the conditions, and it is not appealable by the EQC. Next slide. Okay, so here's the exception that I was referencing. So the exception is there's an automatic legislative approval if the waste is produced by a nuclear power generation facility operating within the state. And this is where the applicability to the TerraPower Natrium facility comes in. It would be subject to Article 15, and it would fit within the context of 1506E in particular, which would allow it to move forward even though there's not a permanent repository. So now the project can move forward, but it still has to comply with portions of the application, reporting, and public review. It's just the repository component that would not be included. All right, next slide. All right, so lastly, we have Article 21, which was passed in 2020 to address small modular nuclear reactors. And the first part of that statutory provision talks about the rulemaking that needs to happen for this to move forward. And that would specifically be promulgation of rules by the EQC and would include a requirement that it would have to be replacing coal or natural gas generation. The combined rated capacity wouldn't be greater than the current rated capacity of the facility. It has to be located on the same site. And I think here's another reference to the NRC and ensuring that we don't interfere with the authorities of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The permit can't be issued until such time as the SMR has received a license from the NRC. And then really what this does, what the permit does is it provides reports and notifications and notices of violations that correspondence between the NRC and the applicant for the facility. All right, next slide. So, as I said, no storage of spent nuclear fuel waste from the SMR until the NRC finalizes their license, and it has to meet all of the requirements of the NRC. Nothing in the article affects the authority of the NRC. Now, this next one is an important definition. I only included this to make the point that an SMR by statute is defined as one that has a rated capacity of not more than 300 megawatts. The Natrium facility has been, as you've heard, as it stands today, is 345 megawatts. Therefore, Article 21 would not apply to the Natrium facility as it's been described to date. And then the last thing related to this particular statute is that the Industrial Siting Act, unlike in Article 15, the Industrial Siting Act would apply to the extent that it doesn't interfere with the authorities of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. All right, last slide. Okay, so as we talked about earlier, the NRC not only will not, cannot relinquish regulatory authority of production and utilization facilities, which includes small modular nuclear reactors. That has come up in conversations. We're in regular communication with the NRC because we're an agreement state as they follow the activities with the Natrium proposal. We've had conversations with the NRC about this, and so they're taking a look at Article 15 and Article 21 as we're having these conversations, and getting comfortable with the fact that, well, we don't believe that there's a preemption issue here, but we'll continue to have those conversations with the NRC as things proceed. So with that, I know I ran through that pretty quickly, but appreciate the opportunity to share that and look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Todd. Appreciated your presentation. And just a note for our listeners, we will be handling all questions at the end to allow our presenters to go through their presentations fluidly. So with that, rounding out our batting order is Tara Nieder with TerraPower to speak about the Natrium project.
Thank you, Casey. And first of all, I want to thank everybody for inviting me here. I'm really excited about Natrium. I don't think I can act as excited as Katie Huff does, because it's just not that kind of person. But this has been the absolute best project that I've ever worked on. And what I see across the board is cooperation and excitement by the Department of Energy, by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, even by the DEQ, and certainly the people in Wyoming, including Wyoming University. So I really appreciate Holly because she has given us a lot of opportunity to interact with the university, and we hope to make the university an integral part of continued learning for our nuclear industry going forward. So with that, next slide. So just real quickly, the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program has certain goals. They are to demonstrate the ability to design, license, construct, start up, and operate the Natrium Advanced Reactor. And I like to say very clearly that we can do all this within budget and schedule, but we will have failed unless we also make the reactor economical. And the difference between what we're doing on Natrium today versus all the other sodium reactors that have been built around the world have been that they've always been developed. The others have all been developed by governments, and economics was probably not one of their higher priorities. In order to build the Natrium reactor, we also have to build the supply chain because it doesn't exist today. As a result of our Natrium demo, we hope to deploy a fleet of Natrium reactors, which will have substantial effect on the emissions going into the atmosphere. And we also want to develop new jobs and a stronger economy. Next slide. So I want to just go through a little bit of our Natrium technology, and then I'll go into the laws that we're required to follow. We have developed the Natrium reactor in close collaboration with GE Hitachi. It builds on the GE Hitachi Prism reactor and also the TerraPower traveling wave reactor. And we also took a lot of insights and ideas from the concentrated solar power industry. And again, all of this is a focus on cost competitiveness, but making sure that obviously we keep things very, very safe. Our strategy towards safety is to simplify as opposed to complicate. I think that in the light water reactor industry, there has been a preponderance of, in order to keep things safe, you add safety systems. But with Natrium, we rely much more on inherent safety, meaning that that there's no way of getting to a situation which is unsafe. So you don't need the extra controls to force it to be safe. And I'll get into a little bit more of that in a future slide. We integrate with and fortify the grid for high renewable penetrations. We recognize that renewables in the electrical industry are growing and will continue to grow, and we want to support that, not take away from that. And then our reactor is a 345 megawatt electric reactor, but we can also increase that power output, particularly in times when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. And we do that through these tanks. So from the reactor, we go through an intermediate loop with that takes the heat from our sodium and heats up salt, molten salts, and that molten salts are stored in these big heavy tanks. And the heat from the molten salt tank is used to run the turbines. So, and then as we spend that heat, it gets converted and moved over to the cold tank, which you see on the other side. Next slide. So we like to say that what we're doing is rethinking what nuclear can be. And we are designing all of our systems to cost. We're trying to keep it very simple, and our focus is on rapid construction. Some of our systems are modular, some are not. Really, each component is looked at specifically to see, does this make sense to make on site, or does it make sense to make in the factory? We do have a very tight schedule, so this is one of our key efforts. And we're also looking at keeping the staffing down to a reasonable level. In the light water industry, one of the big focuses on staff is security, and we're looking at designing the plant so that it is simpler to make sure that it's secure, and that will actually reduce the security staff necessary. We have roughly a 41% net thermal efficiency, And again, we are trying to integrate with renewables. We are a price follower or a need follower for electricity. The reactor will be running 100%, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at the 345 megawatt electric nominal, and then that will flex to 500 megawatts for 5.5 hours through the energy storage system. Next slide. So this is just an identification of what buildings we have on site. One of the things I wanted to point out is the nuclear island, which contains the reactor itself and the fuel handling building and some auxiliary equipment, is separate from the energy island. And so this nuclear island is really the area that the Nuclear Regulatory Control would have oversight over. And then the energy island is intended to be built to to a commercial program, which also reduces the cost of the facility itself. The nuclear island sits on about a 16-acre site, and then when you add the nuclear island and the energy island together, it's about a 44-acre site. Next. So this is just a cutaway of the reactor building and some of the fuel handling buildings and auxiliary building. And a couple of things I wanted to point out here. And first of all, the primary loop, the loop that takes heat from the reactor, is actually all of that stays inside of the reactor itself. So and all of the penetrations in the reactor are through the cover of the reactor. So there's no way for any joints to fail or penetrations to fail in the reactor itself, because everything is above. Also, the reactor is operating at near atmospheric pressure, which is different than most of the nuclear reactors that are in existence today. So you don't have a driver for an overpressure system. This is always at roughly atmospheric pressure. We also have a outer shell around the reactor itself that would contain any sodium if it were to leak. The reactor is a sodium reactor, and sodium is a great material because it's a metal. It is in a liquid state, and it has very high conductivity. And what that allows us to do is from the fuel that's in the center of the core to the outside of the reactor, you have a very strong, very good thermal conductivity. So what we're able to do is to actually cool the reactor in the event of a need to shut down due to an emergency of some sort. The decay heat of the reactor, that residual heat in the reactor once you've shut down, can actually be cooled naturally through natural convection. And so the air in the reactor vessel air cooling system in the basement there would go up through what you see here as RVAC ducts and just cool to atmosphere through those ducts. So cooling is natural, and you don't need any operator interface to get the reactor cooled. Similarly for containment, which is another concern, is because we're at very low pressure, our containment system is very simple. You don't need a big containment vessel to maintain the integrity. And then lastly, on control, where you don't want to have a runaway reactor, if the reactor temperature or power goes up beyond what it's anticipated, we have control rods in the reactor that just drop into place by gravity. So everything is very natural. Any incidences that would result in an overpower system actually gets resolved without any operator interface. Both the reactor and the used fuel pool are underground. In fact, most of our safety equipment is underground, which protects it from things like an aircraft impact or something of that nature. Just to talk about storage for a little bit, the used fuel pool is where we would store the fuel for at least 10 years. We have 10-year capacity, and then we would anticipate to have on-site dry storage as necessary. As you heard earlier, the Department of Energy has not taken possession of the fuel from any of the reactors today. And so we would anticipate some prolonged storage on site until the Department of Energy determines a final repository. Next slide. This is just a picture of our decoupling approach. As you see, the nuclear island is separate from the energy island, as you saw in other ones. And what that does is we really focus our efforts on the safety components of the system. So those are all under very tight rules and under nuclear QA, while other systems that don't have any safety impact can be worked on commercially. Next. And I think that Steve mentioned this on the on NuScale, but there's the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has rules in place that state that you need an emergency zone of 10 miles if you're a reactor, and that 10 miles is something that is not based on well, it may have been based on something in the past where that's really where an emergency could have an impact. But as you get smaller, and also because with sodium reactors, the sodium actually retains the nuclear product. So you actually don't have any impact outside of the site boundary. So our emergency planning zone is planned to be about 400 meters, which essentially allows you to stay within the boundaries, so you won't have to have a concern of any emergency response outside of the site itself. Next slide. I think I've talked about most of these things already, but one concern that has been brought up in the past is that with sodium reactors, sodium does have a reaction with water. And so what we've done is we've excluded water from any areas that have sodium in it. And a big difference between this and previous sodium reactors is that there is no sodium steam generator. So the interface between the sodium goes to salt first, and then the molten salt is what drives the steam generator. Next. Just quickly on schedule, licensing really drives the schedule at this point. We will be announcing the site by the end of this year. And we will be submitting a construction permit application and preliminary safety analysis report to the NRC in August of 2023. The local permits and state permits through the DEQ will be submitted prior to that date. We hope to have a licensing to construct by March of 2025. And then in March of 2026, we will submit an operating license application and a final safety analysis report to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That would allow us to receive a license to operate by March of 2028. Next slide. So this is just a quick overview of the Part 50 licensing process, which is the one we've chosen for Natrium. It is the traditional licensing process from the NRC. They have since issued a Part 52 licensing process, which combines the construction permit and the operating permit. But due to the constraints we have on timing on this program, that we have chosen the Part 50. So after we submit the application to the Nuclear Regulatory Committee, they will do a review. The NRC will hold a public meeting at the site. And just so you know that as part of the construction permit, they're looking at 3 things. First, they're looking at the environmental impact of what could, is the site suitable for the nuclear reactor? Are there anything that we should be protected against? Is that the right site for the reactor? And then, in addition to that, they're looking at the safety of the reactor itself. So there's a lot of information that we provide in terms of the safety of the plant and the design of the plant. And then finally, they're also looking at the company itself, and they're looking at are they financially and technically capable of, for this piece of it, of getting through the construction. They don't want to issue a license to a company that's going to half build a reactor. It has to be completely built. So then they go through a safety review and an environmental review, and then there's 2 boards that actually look at things after the technical review is done. First is the ACRS, which is the Advisory Committee on Reactor Safeguards, and the ASLB, it's the Atomic Safety and Licensing Board, and they're really making sure that everything's been done appropriately. Then a construction permit is issued, which allows us to build on the nuclear portion of the site. We can do some construction before those licenses, but those are limited to things that don't impact the nuclear safety analysis. Then we'll submit the application for the operating license, which is called the FSAR, or Final Safety Analysis Report, and that will undergo the review by the NRC, and then again we'll go through the Advisory Committee on Reactor Safeguards. After all of that, we can get an operating license issued, and only then can we start loading the fuel into the reactor and begin startup of the reactor. Next slide. So as I mentioned, our licensing approach is 10 CFR 50, which is the separate application for construction and operations. We are in a period of change with the NRC. They're issuing a lot of new documents. They're trying to figure out how they can take the tried and true old licensing processes that have been used for light water reactors and apply them to advanced reactors, which are fairly different. So they have provided us guidance on that. We are working to the updated draft outline of licensing modernization project for advanced reactor license applications. And then we are using that licensing modernization project to inform the contents of our application. There are also a number of activities. RCAP is the Advanced Reactor Content of Application. So we're following that, as well as TICAP, which is the Technology Inclusive Content of Application project. So we're monitoring all of those things and trying to follow both the new and the old to get through the regulatory process. Next slide. Just a few comments on the regulatory process. As mentioned previously, the NRC has to review and approve a nuclear plant before it's constructed or operated. They also maintain oversight over the construction and operation of the power plant throughout its lifetime to ensure its compliance with the regulations. I would anticipate they will have resident inspectors, as they do at all plants around the nation. All nuclear plants also have to undergo the environmental review, a safety review, and an antitrust review. And the NRC will also determine whether an applicant is qualified financially and technically to hold that license. And the NRC also has specific requirements for the nuclear plant operators and senior operators, and you have to follow those requirements as well. Next slide. So these are the applicable regulations. I know I've hit the most important ones. 10 CFR 50 obviously is our basis for our safety analysis report, and 10 CFR 51 for the environmental review. 10 CFR 55 tells us how we have to operate how to license our plant operators. And then there's a number of other ones as well. And when we have to watch on it is 10 CFR 170, 171 is how NRC applies their fees. But there's numerous regulations here, obviously, but then we also have a number of regulatory guidelines and standards that we follow as well. So all of those, the nice thing about the NRC regulations is everything is very transparent. It's all on the NRC website, nrc.gov. But it is a fairly long and laborious project to get through all of the licensing requirements. Next step. So this is just a summary of how it's done. You have the environmental review, the safety review, and public hearings. Really at the point where the NRC has approved our application for a license, they're the ones that interface with the public to show that there's that the plant is safe. So they do have a very strong role in the process here. Next. Again, we are in a big flux in terms of the regulations. There is a big effort going on at the NRC to issue 10 CFR 53, which is risk-informed technology inclusive regulatory framework for advanced reactors. Unfortunately, it's not going to be ready in time for us to follow that, but we are taking aspects of those and trying to incorporate that into our submittal. They're also doing some work on the physical security requirements to basically, I call it a graded approach, but really what's happening there is they're trying to assess the requirements they've had on the larger plants. Should there be modifications for the smaller and advanced reactors? Emergency preparedness, we've touched on this already. They're looking at consequences as opposed to just specifying a designated distance for emergency preparedness. And then we have the licensing modernization project itself. So a lot of things are new. It's really an effort for that's the NRC has been going through and involving the industry to really make licensing simpler and really to focus the attention on safety significant things as opposed to applying the same level of scrutiny on everything in the plant. So it's a very good move, but it's also because we're in flux, there is a bit of regulatory uncertainty at this point. Next slide. And I think that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Tara, and thank you to all of our panelists. If we were in person, I would ask that you guys are given a round of applause, but in lieu of this being online, you're just going to have to accept my thanks in the meantime. We've had a lot of great questions in the chat. The first one is a holdover from actually Dr. Huff's presentation, but I think this group's very well suited to address it. In the West, we are challenged with water scarcity. A lot of the time, more years than we're not, it seems like anymore. So will the Natrium reactor or potentially the project at Idaho National Laboratory use a lot of water?
I guess I could respond to that one for Natrium and not for Idaho, but what we have done, and you can do dry cooling and those sort of things, but for the demo at that we're putting in Wyoming, it will require water, but the water usage will be roughly 2/3 of what is used at for the same size coal plant. So it's an actual reduction in water need.
And I can comment on some of the small reactors in general. As Tara said, there is a dry cooling option. Of course, you take an energy penalty for that. With the new scale plant, I don't have the exact number of water withdrawal and then eventual water usage, which are typically two different things. But I know they do have their water rights secure.
Thank you to you both. I think that's going to be a question that you all are hearing a lot about as you move forward. Our next question is kind of more along the social aspects. Folks in the chat have asked, how do you guys envision nuclear working with more traditional energy industries, specifically the elephant in the room in Wyoming is coal-fired power plants. I know that everybody on this panel has worked in that field a little bit. So if you have any thoughts on how to sort of win over the hearts and minds, I would be interested in hearing.
I guess I'll answer that one from my perspective is we are not trying to shut down coal mines or coal plants, excuse me. But there has been increased pressure, obviously due to global warming that there's market-driven activities that are showing that some of these coal plants will get shut down. So we are targeting locations where a decision has already been made that the coal plants will be shut down. And so I see our reactor coming in and actually providing another source of income for those people that will have their jobs displaced when the coal plants shut down.
Yeah, so I'd love to comment on that. I see, I take even a further, in terms of time frame, view on nuclear and the potential for economic development in Wyoming. So I don't see it. I don't see the debate as pitting one source of energy versus another. Rather, I see an opportunity to figure out what highly economic energy sources can be plugged into industrial operations and focus on development of high value industrial products using clean energy. So clean energy isn't necessarily the principal focus, it's what you can do with it. And to the question of what you can do with it, there's tremendous opportunity, again, for advanced production, and then also for manufacturing systems that both generate the energy for producing these clean industrial products, but also on the non-nuclear side. And I think what you'll see then, once you pencil out what that kind of clean energy driven economic development vision looks like, there's a huge value in terms of jobs and revenue for Wyoming, serving the rest of the world with clean products. So it's not one source of energy versus another. It really is, how do we think differently about what you can do with it?
Thank you for your thoughts, Dr. Almer. That reminds me of, Governor Gordon, especially on energy, has promoted an all of the above strategy, and that's what comes to mind when I hear both you and Ms. Neer speak about the integration between all those systems. We have a question in the chat that is directed at Tara, and on the diagram of the Terra Power facility in Wyoming, there's diesel generators bank included there. Is that, can you please explain the integration of that with the overall plant functioning?
Sure. The diesel generator is used for backup supply, but it is not a safety diesel generator. So we are not relying on it for, for safe shutdown of the plant.
Very good. Thanks for that explanation. And there was another question directed to you as well in the chat specifically. It said that you mentioned the integration between nuclear reactors and renewable energy sources. Can you talk about how that functions or could function as a practical matter on the grid?
Sure. That's why we have those big molten salt tanks, right? So and those tanks can actually be sized to keep storage for as long as you want, because the molten salt has really retains heat very, very well. So you don't actually lose much of the heat. But when there's not a need for power, we would keep the nuclear reactor running, but the tanks would then start to store that energy. So right now for the demo plant, we're talking about 5.5 hours of capacity for at over 50% more than, at 500 megawatt electric versus 345. So, that basically gives us a surge capacity. And then we can also run it so that the turbines are only running at about, we can provide down to as low as 100 megawatt electric. So there is a big fluctuation. So our reactor is not load following, although it could to some extent if we wanted it to. But the reactor is the expensive part of the system. So you want to allow that to run all the time. And then, and so your real flexible electric generation is on your energy island. So that way, when when you have the wind blowing or the sun shining, you're keeping that reactor operating, but you're also only putting very minimal power on the grid.
I think we could all call to mind a couple places in Wyoming where I swear to goodness the wind never stops blowing.
Yeah, I've
Dr.
noticed
Almer.
that.
Yeah, Casey and Tara, I just wanted to add, not on the integration side, but a demonstration of the robustness of those sodium cooled systems. Actually, there's some really interesting demonstrations that were conducted clear back when I was with Argonne National Laboratory West, and that was with the EBR2 reactor, and they did this inherent safety demonstration tests, and I think you could still get video of those online. So those simulated two of the most aggressive accident conditions for a reactor, losing cooling and losing heat sink. And because of the characteristics that Tara's pointed out with liquid sodium and the fast reactor technology, you can see how those naturally shut themselves down without any intervention. So I'd encourage people to take a look at those. Those tests were done back in the late 80s, I believe, or mid 80s. Really interesting though.
We have a question in the chat, and it's very technical and outside my area, so I'm just going to read it directly so it's not misstate anything. Selena Sauer asked, would there be any RCRA mixed low or high level waste generated by the natrium reactor, and would a theoretical interim storage facility accept mixed, meaning both RCRA and AEA waste?
Okay, so we are starting up the natrium reactor with traditional fuel that has been used by the Department of Energy previously in FFTF and EBR2. And what that has is it has a thin layer of sodium in the fuel itself. And that is the RCRA waste. Okay, so it wasn't permitted in Yucca Mountain, but that just has to be assessed. We have been looking at ways on the disposal side of that. We have some innovative ideas in terms of deep borehole and how that could be disposed of in that way, but it's only wasn't allowed in Yucca Mountain because that's what Yucca Mountain designed it to. It's not that it can't be put in a repository. It just wasn't in the criteria going for Yucca Mountain.
Thank you. I appreciate that explanation. I have a follow-up question. I saw that Todd was chatting with somebody in the Q&A and regarding Wyoming's legislation on SMRs. And the question is, so there's no legislation governing reactors greater than 300 megawatts in Wyoming right now. Is that correct?
Yes, Casey, that's correct. The way the statute reads right now, it only covers the small modular reactors that they're clearly defined as those that are less than 300 megawatts. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that the DEQ wouldn't have traditional regulatory authorities over a facility as well. But the NRC would be for larger facilities. The NRC would be the primary licensing agency.
Gotcha. Thank you for your perspective. It's an area that's definitely in transition, but also has a lot of potential. So unfortunately, that has to be our last question, but I want to thank you guys again so much for your time today and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, well done, Casey, Tara, Steve, and Todd. Thank you so much for your remarks there. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody did. We're going to take a short break here, about 15 minutes. We'll come back at 10:45 for our next panel, which is Hot Topics on Oil and Gas. So we'll see you back here at 10:45. Thank you.